John, after we get started, I'm on. Good evening. Welcome to another edition of Drugs, Crime, and Politics, brought to you by the Drug Policy Forum of Texas. Good evening. I'm your host, Buford Terrell. Tonight I have with me an old friend, Duane Jones, and Duane happens to be a collector of things related to cannabis, particularly in its first life as a rather widely used medicinal. And he brought some of his goodies along with us. Don't worry, that DEA seal in front of the table doesn't mean we've sold out to the government. It's merely one of the many things Duane has collected. Before we get started talking to him about some of his things, there are several items that I want to mention. One of the most important, both locally and probably nationwide, is this afternoon Dean Becker announced that the James Baker III Institute of Rice University had agreed to house the archives of Dean's cultural baggage programs. These will ultimately include having all of the audio tapes and the transcripts up on the Baker Institute website. This is a great step forward both for Dean and his programs and for those of us of more of a scholarly bent as well. I'd like to give my congratulations to both parties to that deal, and also thank Professor Bill Martin of the Baker Institute for his work in making it happen. The second thing I want to mention is that some of you know for 2 or 3 years now I have been almost obsessing about what the price of legal marijuana as opposed to the illegal product would be. And when I started out, I did comparison shopping and compared it to coffee and tea and figured out that a reasonable price would be $1 an ounce. Since then, I've decided that that's overpriced, and lately what I've been saying is that marijuana is just like broccoli and should cost the same. But there was a news report this last week about the use of drugs by American troops in Afghanistan. And in this report, it said that the troops were using, among other things, hashish, which I'm sure most of you know is a purified, processed resin from the marijuana plants. And it said that in Afghanistan, they were paying about $1.50 an ounce for hashish. Another report a month or so ago from Mexico said that baled marijuana could be bought at the farms where it was grown for about $25 a pound, and $25 a pound is just about $1.50 an ounce. So we're starting to get some real-world reports that back up my own more theoretical calculations. And that's where we see the war in Mexico as being so foolish. If we could drop the price of marijuana from $400 an ounce to $1 an ounce, about half of the money going to the Mexican cartels comes from marijuana. If we could take that half, or $15 billion a year, and reduce it by 90 or 99%, then first, there wouldn't be anything left for them to fight over, and second, they certainly couldn't afford to buy military-grade weapons to fight with. It's the prohibition that causes the problems. One other thing of local interest, this week the Houston Press has come out with a cover story, "Weed Takes Roots Weed Takes Roots is a very long, serious article about the trend toward legalization of marijuana in this country. Now, we had an email after the last show. A viewer wanted to know what our projections about the effect of Houston's new mayor, Anise Parker, will have on marijuana in the city of Houston. Frankly, I know what I read in the papers and see on TV. My speculations on this aren't any better than anyone else's. A little later tonight, I'll talk about them a little bit, but if any of you have ideas about what differences, if any, you think her tenure will make in this area, please call in and share your views on it with us. Now, earlier this week, I ran across something in an email about medicinal bottles purporting to be bottles from legal cannabis preparations were appearing on eBay, but that the bottles appearing there were fakes with newly created and artificially aged labels. So one of the things I've asked Duane to bring tonight are a couple of bottles from his collection. One of these is a bottle of a cannabis preparation. The other is actually from heroin when it was legal. Tell us about that cannabis bottle, Duane.
Well, let me get the mic. I hung up here again. One thing about cannabis is that it's been a medicine that's been used for thousands of years. I mean, it's documented that, Buford, that it's been used from the childbirth, from the Israeli little girl from 1,000 years BC, all the way up until 1937, when it was essentially taxed out of existence. This particular bottle, I give about $115 for it. Still has the residue in it, still has the stopper in it. It actually is a real one, because I did research the company that made it. And this one right here is indicated in the treatment of all diseases of the respiratory organs accompanied by coughs and dyspnea, including bronchitis, asthma, pulmonary tuberculosis, hay fever, whooping cough, etc. A teaspoonful every 2 to 3 hours. So again, one of the remarkable things about cannabis is you can't overdose on it, ever. There's never been a documented dose, and according to Lester Grinspoon, the lethal dose ratio is in excess of 20,000 to 1, which, well, and again, according to Mr. Grinspoon, Dr. Grinspoon, it's probably close to 40,000 to 1. So
well, I was going to say, from the pharmacologist I've talked to, that 20,000 to 1 ratio is somewhere between a guess and an estimate, because even dealing with rats, they have never been able to cram enough into a rat to kill it. So
I have here also 2 exceedingly rare books. These are back from the 1970s. The anti-tumor properties of cannabis was being discovered, and the Lewis lung cell studies and things like that were coming out from the University of Virginia. Well, all this good research was actually being documented, and then all of a sudden, cannabis was not going to be a bad drug. I mean, it just simply could not be contained. And so Gerald Ford went on a book burning tour, and I even found this particular book right here from a librarian in Puerto Rico.
Now, that particular set of books, as I understand it, are actually the proceedings of a 2-day conference on cannabis therapeutics that was conducted by one of the National Institutes of Health in 1974.
Yes, sir.
So that this was actually a government-organized and funding symposium on cannabis at that time.
This right here, Buford, is a monograph of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Actually, this is the research. Oh, cannabis has no medicinal properties. It has no pharmacological issues. Oh, yes, it does, because the NIDA did that. Just for a quick review here, some of the articles include anti-tumor properties of cannabinoids. Tetrahydrocannabinol is an effective antidepressant and appetite-stimulating agent in advanced cancer patients. Bronchial effects of marijuana smoke in asthma. Acute effects of marijuana in airway dynamics in spontaneous and experimentally induced bronchial asthma.
If I may say something here.
This is...
Yeah, and then the first one that you wrote about the anti-tumor properties. In the 1990s, one of the Spanish universities published their findings showing anti-tumor effects of cannabis. And the main study that they cited in theirs was this book, which no one in the United States was aware of at the time. Well, now, interestingly enough, also on this, I recently went back and looked at Dr. Woodward's testimony to Congress in 1937 on the marijuana bill, and he was the representative of the American Medical Association. And one of the things he said was that the American Medical Association was afraid that if the bill were passed, that it would suppress research on the cannabinoids, and that among the areas he expressly mentioned where even in 1937 research looked promising were on anti-tumor effects, anti-nausea drugs, pain management. So even at the time Congress was outlawing the drug, they had right in front of them doctors saying, yes, it has these medical properties. And we've spent the 80 years since rediscovering that.
You've heard Dr. Woodward is not Dr. Woodward, it's Dr. Woodward, as you said.
Woodward, yes.
He was actually the attorney representing the American Medical Association, and they run it over his head, and they didn't want to hear what he had to say. And I also have some documents, which I don't have with me today, where in 1941, there was a Roger Adams that was actually discovering the chemical properties of the oils in 1941, and it was coming up. But again, Reefer Madness, and my collection specifically, I've tried to gear it towards the documenting the origins of Reefer Madness, and Roger Adams was actually coming up with some of the new properties of the cannabis plant and the oils and things in 1941.
Well, let me say something else about Dr. Woodward, because he's an important figure in American history that gets overlooked or brushed aside. He was not only a lawyer, he was also a doctor.
He was.
He was one of the early founders of the AMA, and he represented them in their dealings with Congress from before the passage of the Harrison Act in 1914 until well past the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. So he's a very crucial, important man in our story. Okay, I noticed you also brought another bottle with you.
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay.
This one here, let me pull my mic loose again.
Okay.
This is actually glycoheroin. And again, the reason that it's glycoheroin, this particular one here is pruno heroin. This actually has a half a grain of heroin hydrochloride, half a grain per each fluid ounce. Now, why would you give heroin to a baby? Why would you give heroin to a baby?
Okay, let's take a break and we'll come back and answer that question when we come back. So we will see you again in a couple of minutes.
I think the Bible is pretty clear that it expects justice and mercy and compassion. And I believe that to start with, and from my work as a criminologist, that our drug policy falls quite short on the issue of justice, that people are unequally treated depending on their ethnicity, their social class. And the Bible contains more than 2,000 scriptures decrying the injustice related to poverty, to oppression, to corrupt government.
We're back. Tonight I'm talking to Duane Jones about some of his collectibles from the earlier stages in our nation's relationship to drugs, and you were about to tell us why anyone would ever give heroin to a baby.
Well, again, Buford, if you think back 100 years ago, you didn't have a CVS, you didn't have a Walgreens or an Eckerd's or things like that, and the doctors more or less politely treated the symptoms. They just didn't order another test. If you were a mother and you had a baby that was being breastfed and it wasn't doing well and it was having failure to thrive and it was coming up and it's coming up cold here this weekend, the Eskimos are coming to town, and that baby was not doing well and it was getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and it just simply was not keeping its ability to breathe up to par, and it was coming down with an upper respiratory tract infection, and it couldn't expel the phlegm, and it's choking down and it is going to die. The reason that you would give a baby heroin is that it has a serious side effect. As an analog of morphine, it has a unique property in that it does not depress respiratory effort.
Right.
And it also soothes the respiratory membranes and things like that, but for that baby, it has a serious side effect, and that is rhinitis, runny nose. It has mucolytic properties that allow that baby to start coughing up all of the phlegm that's going to kill it.
Yeah.
I didn't say stick a needle in its arm. I'm talking about a spoon, 2 or 3 spoons, you know, whatever. And the baby there will regain its ability to breathe simply because now it can expel the phlegm and the mucus and stuff that's going to make it die.
Yeah.
So that's why you would give heroin to a baby.
Well, along the same line, while it was legal, the major medical use for heroin was to give it to tubercular patients as a cough reliever for the same sort of things, that it relaxed the airwaves. It lost a lot of its necessity when they developed drugs that could handle tuberculosis in the 1930s. But until that time, it was one of the mainstays of treating tubercular patients.
Buford, this is the Ringo Reinhardt Company from Baltimore, Maryland, and it says, the valuable powder of ammonia chloride to increase the bronchial secretions together with the expectorant action of wild cherry, such and such, the antiseptic and sedative effects of eucalyptol and heroin render this combination a most admirable one for all inflammations of the respiratory passages and for allaying cough and irritation. Pruno heroin is best given in doses of 1/2 to 2 teaspoons every 3 to 4 hours. And again, it has a 1/2 grain per fluid ounce, so this is pretty potent stuff.
Now, grains are really old-fashioned.
That is. This is real stuff.
Can you translate to us what a grain would be in modern measurements?
Well, 1/50th of a grain, again, I've been a nurse now for 19 years. 1/50th of a grain sublingually would be for your chest pain. That would be angina. If you translate 150th of a grain of nitroglycerin, that would be about 4/10ths of a milligram.
Okay.
So 1/50th versus a half, when you do fractions, 1/50th is a lot less than a half.
Yeah.
So that's real deal stuff there on the heroin stuff. And again, it's not a bunch of drug addicts. I mean, it has medicinal properties that legitimizes what they were using it for back then, just like my cannabis here.
You know, when we think about it, even today, a large part of what doctors do is alleviating symptoms in addition to possibly trying to get to the cure of the disease itself. I mean, if I've got a fever, I want the fever reduced. If I've got a headache, I want the pain to go away, and then we'll worry about what's causing it and try to fix it. But symptom easing is an important part of medicine even today.
Buford, before I had a comminuted compound fracture of the left lower tibia. I had no knowledge of what cannabis does. And one day I was surfing on eBay, and I saw something on eBay. I don't even remember what it was. And I knew that from the 1970s, cannabis has medicinal properties because I got a new girlfriend back then. And before that, I had never tested it in my life. But I found out you can't function on Dilaudid.
That's right.
That's hydromorphone.
Yeah.
It'll hit you. It'll turn your bowels to concrete, and you just simply cannot function on Dilaudid every day.
Let's take a pause here, because I read a letter to the editor in, I believe, one of the Chicago papers this week that kind of just pulled my chain under. This woman is writing in to protest the proposed medical marijuana law in Illinois. And she says, but you don't have to use that dangerous drug marijuana for pain relief because there are much, much safer alternatives already approved by the FDA. And when I started thinking, when we look at alternatives for pain relief, let's start with Tylenol, acetaminophen. Is that
liver
safe?
transplants come from overdosing on Tylenol because you're overdosing on your Vicodin. Oh, yes.
Okay, yep.
Not the Vicodin.
Acetaminophen does tear up livers.
Yes.
The other alternatives for pain relief are the relatives of heroin: morphine, Dilaudid, Oxycontin, Vicodin. We could make a list 20. Now, are these more safe than marijuana?
Buford, considering that I've had broken bones and I've put my own tourniquet on bleeding out, I can tell you, sir, that without any reservation, cannabis has unique properties because it obtuns pain, O-B-T-U-N-D. That means that it alters your perception of pain. I mean, it doesn't take it away. If it's severe, you've got to go to a morphine something. Yeah. But if it's moderately on the scale of 1 to 10, if it's a 4 or 5, you can generally control it with a cannabinoid compound, and it's genetically unlimited for focusing on particular types of pain.
Let's see what our caller has to say. Hello, caller. You're on the air.
How you guys doing today?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm fine. I was wondering, have you guys ever noticed when they show these television commercials for like Viagra, Cialis, and those types of drugs, they always have these side effects. If you lose sight for 4 hours, if you a sudden loss of hearing, contact your doctor. There's so many side effects in these approved drugs. Yeah. I think they're just using a lot of humans to experiment with these drugs. and it's so many side effects, but the doctors and the FDA work together, and maybe 10 years from now, the people could win a lawsuit, but you lose so much of your health in the process when something natural is much more better.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to comment that Viagra, the Cialis, all of the good stuff there, you notice that it's, for the men, it's vasodilation that makes us do our thing.
Yeah.
What do you think? Why do you think you get red eyes whenever you smoke a good medical grade joint? Well, vasodilation, the sclera of the eye, literally is oversupplied with blood flow. The diabetic man that's fixing to lose his foot from lack of ischemia, lack of oxygen delivery from ischemia. The cannabis has vasodilatory effects simply because of what it does. Your cigarettes, now your nicotine, that's a vasoconstrictor.
Yeah.
But like the caller said there, you got all these side effects. But cannabis there, you know when you're getting too much of that because you're just going to take a nap and you'll wake up and you'll be fine. So I'm not worried about having to take Viagra or something when I can grow my medicine. This right here, weed takes root. I mean, cannabis is coming. You can just get used to it. I mean, cannabis has always been legal up until 1937, and it's coming again because Prohibition failed in the Garden of Eden. God said, don't eat from the pomegranate tree or the apple tree, and they did. And since then, Prohibition by design, Buford, is designed to fail. And when you got all these thugs over there in Mexico tearing the country down because they're looting it because they can make all this money, the policy is the problem. The prohibition is the problem simply because you're paying someone to take a risk. And when you take away that risk, you take away the money, and then everybody can get the benefits, because I've also got all the research studies, some of them, like this one right here from Iowa from 1943. And it's got the real nice, pretty, well, I just lost my place here, but it's got the cannabis plant right here in the middle of this thing right here, where you got a tractor right there, and let's see if I can find another place here. Where you got the, here it is. Yeah. You've got they're growing it for World War II. I mean, why do you have to have all this petroleum coming from Saudi Arabia whenever the American farmer can grow the world right here? It just doesn't compute to me.
Well, I want to go back to the other side of what our caller was saying, and this is about the side effects of drugs. Now, most drugs, or probably all drugs, have a bunch of different effects. Those you're looking for are called effects. Those you're not looking for are called side effects. You may have heard of a drug called Rogaine that's doing a good job, some people say, of growing hair on bald heads. It originally was tested as a heart drug. It didn't do very good at that, but someone noticed that it had a side effect of growing hair on the subjects. Now, supposedly in the testing process for approving drugs for marketing, and remember, the FDA doesn't approve drugs as medicine. It only approves the marketing plan the manufacturer has for it. The drugs are supposed to be tested for safety. And until the late 1990s, most of that testing was fairly well done, and most of the very serious side effects were detected before the drugs were approved. But there's something else to think about too. If I'm offered a drug that's my only chance of staying alive for more than the next 30 minutes, and it has a possible side effect that half of the people that take it lose the use of their left arm, and obviously there's no such drug as that in the world, that's probably a risk I'm willing to run. So to some extent, it's a balancing of what's the cost versus what's the harm.
Buford, as being a nurse all the years that I've been, it hurts me in my heart to see people taking just pure damn poison when at MD Anderson or some of the other places there, when you've got the anti-tumor properties right here.
Yeah, and that's true.
It's amazing.
We have another caller. Hello, caller. You're on the air.
Yes, I'm trying to find out what is the purpose of this show, because would you agree that most people watching this show are for the legalization of marijuana or some form of it?
Let's retool that to re-legalization.
Okay, what's the purpose of this show? Part of it, I think, and this goes to my career as an educator, part of the purpose, I think, of the show is to help people find out more about what the drug laws do, how they function, and to some extent how to go about changing them, and even what drugs are what concern and what are their effects. You know, it's one thing to say, yeah, let's legalize marijuana, but just saying that doesn't say anything about how it should be accomplished, what should go along with it, or even why it should be done. And as long as those laws are out there, those concerned about them or their effects, I think, still need a place to get together and talk about it and learn about it. And
Buford, I'd like to tell you that right now we have a synthetic society, and at one time we had an organic society. And cannabis is the world champion biosynthesizer sunlight, and when we're getting an additional 250,000 people a day added to the planet, everybody's going green. Hello, this is the real green right here. I mean, you know.
I think I would probably disagree with you here and say that we have been a synthetic society ever since the first time an Egyptian ground up some grain, mixed it with water, and baked it into bread instead of eating raw food.
Well, it's organic, though. It's not plastic, though.
And when they turned some of that grain into beer, we were into doing the processing. But let's take a break and then come back.
All right.
Hi, this is Willie Nelson for NORML. For 30 years, NORML has provided a voice for the millions of Americans who smoke marijuana responsibly. More than 500,000 Americans are arrested each year for smoking pot. These are ordinary citizens like you and me, whose lives and careers are being needlessly destroyed. To learn how you can help, contact NORML at www.norml.org or call toll-free at 888-67-NORML.
The jury right to say not guilty is an essential safeguard against injustice, which dates back to English common law and the founding of the United States. Jurors in early 19th century America routinely refused to enforce the Alien and Sedition Act, and they rejected the Fugitive Slave Act. Jurors in early 20th century America refused to enforce alcohol prohibition. The injustices of the war on drugs have become obvious to many Americans. In cases where the law, prosecutorial excesses, and the likely sentence seem manifestly unfair, jury nullification ensures the citizen juror a more equal status with those who write the laws. Please visit the Fully Informed Jury Association, FIJA.org. Please keep such decisions private. Nullification is your right, your responsibility, perfectly legal and just.
You're watching the Drug, Crime, and Politics show. I need less business. Help change the laws.
And that's more
Fewer
important.
people
I had to do.
for this foolishness will help all of us.
Hi, I'm Ethan Nadelman, the founder.
Okay, you're back with Drugs, Crime, and Politics. I'm your host, Buford Terrell. With me tonight is Duane Jones, who is a nurse and a collector of all things cannabis, as well as some other drug memorabilia from past decades. And we've been talking about drugs. I'd kind of like to switch the subject for a little while and talk about a question I got through email after the last show, and that is what effect I think that our new mayor will have on marijuana in Houston. And as I said, I've got no special expertise here. I have never met Mayor Parker. I know about as much as anyone else that reads the local papers. But I think I can say a few things, and I please invite any of you that can add to the discussion or join me in speculation to call in. We'll see what Duane has to say about it if he wants to. First, I think in some ways she's going to be more open to listening to people than we have seen in the past. As near as I can tell, Her primary concerns are delivering services and doing so effectively, efficiently, and economically. We've got to remember that for a number of years she's been controller of the city, where her whole job was watching where the dollars go and putting them where they were doing the most good. She's already said she intends to make some changes in the police department, both to save money and to make it more effective. She's expressed concern about the lack of the number of officers on the street. I suspect then that she would be open at least to discussing implementing the bill the legislature passed 2 years ago, allowing the use of citations instead of arrests in misdemeanor marijuana cases. Now, the problem there is that for a plan to be put in effect, it requires a joint effort from the city and the county and a plan imposed or put together by the administrative district judges. We've had massive changes all across the board with a new district attorney, a new sheriff, a new police chief coming in. I think this is quite possible, and it's something that would lead to quite a bit of savings in manpower and money. That's quite possible. She is in a long-established same-sex relationship that dates back to the days when that was illegal under state laws. So she's probably not going to be one of these reflexive, the law is the law and that's all there is kinds. Okay, let's take a call and then maybe go on. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Yes, so what exactly can the citizen of Houston do to get some type of legislation passed for marijuana?
Okay, that's a good question. What can a citizen of Houston do to get legislation passed? Unfortunately, most legislation that would have any effect has to be passed by the state legislature in Austin. The first and most effective thing you can do is make sure who you're voting for in the election in this coming November. The other thing that's important is to make sure you know who your representatives at the city and the state level are, and that includes both representatives and senators, and tell them what you want to see happen. And when I say tell them, what we have heard is the most effective way is to handwrite a letter and send it to them through the mail with a real stamp on it. That has much more effect than emails or phone calls or anything else. They've all got offices in their district. Go talk to them. We have another caller. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
That sounds fine, but what politician is actually going to say that they're for marijuana?
Okay, that's another good question. We've got one politician in California, at least, that has introduced a bill to legalize marijuana in that state. We have had majority politicians in about a dozen states that have passed medical marijuana laws. If we look at the National Congress, just this year in Congress at the federal level, they passed an important bill that allows federal funding for needle exchange programs for intravenous drug users. I say passed, it was passed by a vote that makes it a part of the health reform bill. And they passed another law that reversed a 20-year-old law, which in effect allows the District of Columbia to have medical marijuana. Now, the problem is politicians are chickens. they've got all of the bravery of a marshmallow peep. So what has to happen is that they have to hear from enough voters to convince them that there's less to be afraid of voting for reform than there is in voting against it. And the minute they're convinced that there are more voters in favor of change, then they'll change their mind. One of the problems in the last session of the state legislature, we heard from some politicians that said they had not heard from a single voter on any of the marijuana issues in front of the legislature. And on the local level, you can do even more. I can tell you about Houston. Other cities are somewhat the same. In Houston, the city council meets every week at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesdays. If you submit your name 30 minutes in advance, you can stand up and talk to the city council in the middle of the meeting for 3 minutes on anything your heart desires. And that can be about arresting people for marijuana. Now, we saw the Houston Press earlier tonight with a cover story on weed takes root. I hope next week there will be a dozen letters to the editor about how great the story is. Anytime the Houston Chronicle runs a drug story, and frankly they average about 3 or 4 a day, their editor should get a desk full of letters to the editor about that story. And it really doesn't matter if they're printed or not, because even in turning them down, some editor has to read them, and you're educating the editor. Now, doesn't sound like much, but I remember when I was a kid, Frank Sinatra sang a song called High Hope. And it was about an ant trying to cut down a rubber tree plant. And the idea was that that ant could do it if he took enough little bitty nibbles and just kept after it. To some extent, we're the ant taking little bitty nibbles around the great big money encrusted rubber tree plant of the government. The other thing you can do, and this also dates back to when I was a baby lawyer just starting to practice in the 1970s, if you're called for a jury duty on a drug case, they'll ask you questions about whether you can serve on that jury. You can say, no, I could never convict anyone of a stupid law like this. When people started doing that, when possession of mere marijuana residue could send you to the state prison for at least 2 years. District judges in Lubbock, a very conservative part of the state, were having to call 150 to 180 people to get 12 people on a marijuana jury, and they couldn't always do it then. Shortly after that, the state reduced possession from a felony to a misdemeanor. If we had enough citizens simply say, I cannot serve on a jury sending people to jail for that, then pretty soon the law changes. You got anything you want to add?
I just wanted to say there is this particular article. I'd suggest everybody get this article for starters, because again, this gives a really good overview. I mean, I've been involved with this since the 1988 or 89 when Richard Lee was on West Alabama, and I taped him across from his shop over there in the next lot next door, and we had one hell of a crazy party over there, and that was in 1988 or 89. Yeah. So I've been doing this a long time. So the ball has now, Buford, just started rolling good. I mean, this is a really good article. So I suggest everyone out there go get your copy and sort of keep this here for a little bit of a review. The other thing is there's a state representative, Elliot Nashtat. He puts the bill in front of the House there in Austin every year. It even mentions it here in the article. So all you have to do is call your rep and ask them where they're at on that.
Yeah. They're telling me we need to take a break again. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Mitchell Lawrence, a 17-year-old from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He won't be graduating from high school with his friends this spring. He can't. He's in jail, serving a 2-year sentence for selling 1 joint's worth of marijuana, about a teaspoonful, to an undercover cop. He's never been arrested before, but he got 2 years in prison for 1 joint's worth of pot. Not community service, not a fine. 2 years. A cost to taxpayers of nearly $100,000, and a criminal record for life. How could this happen in America when 100 million Americans have smoked marijuana? It takes 2 things, a bad law and a cruel prosecutor. Mitchell was busted in a drug-free school zone. But drug-free zone laws keep drugs out of our schools and protect our kids, right? Wrong. These laws do nothing to protect children. They just fill our prisons with young people like Mitchell Lawrence. 98% of people arrested in drug-free school zones weren't selling drugs to children. 95% of all sales aren't near any schools. And most of those arrested didn't even know they were in a so-called school zone, including Mitchell Lawrence. He didn't know that virtually the entire town of Great Barrington, like most American cities, is covered by giant drug-free zones. Mandatory prison for anyone arrested within 1,000 feet of a school. That's 3 football fields. It's a bad law that cruel prosecutors abuse, like fanatical District Attorney David Capeless. He decided to press school zone charges on Mitchell Lawrence, a felony for a $20 sale. What happened to Mitchell is happening to young Americans all around the country. The only thing unusual about Mitchell is the color of his skin. 97% of all people arrested in drug-free zones aren't white.
Okay, I guess we're back.
We're back. Well, I was looking at a couple of things that Duane showed me. One of them is a picture postcard that was mailed in 1912. Shows a little boy in a sailor suit, and he's saying, "Why don't you care? I'm only smoking rope."
It's postmarked 1912.
Which makes it one of...
Pre-reefer madness, by the way.
Well, it makes it one of the very, very, very first evidences of the use of marijuana in the United States that I have ever seen. As near as I can tell, marijuana was non-existent in this country until 1910. There was a small amount of hashish use on the East Coast, but it had pretty well dropped out. And here we have an advertising card.
That's the package insert for thalidomide.
For thalidomide. And Duane was asking me, why can doctors prescribe thalidomide, but they can't prescribe cannabis?
This is chemotherapy in a pill. You do not get pregnant under any circumstances because it's teratogenic. That means that it's monster producing and you have the flipper babies. Now your doctor can prescribe this.
Yeah.
Chemotherapy in a pill. But why can't they prescribe cannabis? Where's the rationale, the reasoning, and the logic to deny cannabis?
Well, there's one very good reason.
It's politics, I guess.
The main reason is that right now it takes a minimum of about $500 million to do the clinical testing and take a drug through FDA approval.
And this one, Buford, has never killed anybody.
Wait a minute.
So why do we need all that?
The only reason why people will spend that much money is because it's a drug they have a patent on, and that they will have an absolute monopoly and no one else can sell it for 20 years. Marijuana has not been approved for sale. Notice I don't say approved as a medicine. It has not been approved for sale simply because no one has had a spare $500 million to spend on the process. If someone were willing to pay for, and actually they'd probably only need stage 3 clinical trials, pay for the preparation and the procedures for a new drug application, I have very little doubts that marijuana would be approved for marketing by the FDA. But remember, the FDA doesn't approve drugs.
Here's all the clinical right here. Lots of it.
I'm not sure that those studies would meet. Remember, FDA is not looking for clinical proof. They're looking for proof for marketing purposes. And that's all they do is approve marketing. There's only one person that can approve a substance as being an effective and useful medicine. And that's a doctor presenting it by prescription, dispensing, or otherwise to a patient. And he does that subject to state medical disciplinary laws and state malpractice laws. The federal government has absolutely no authority to say whether something is or is not a medicine.
Because that's why the doctor gets his license from the state, not from the federal.
Well,
exactly.
The Supreme Court has consistently, for nearly a century, said that under the Constitution, only states have the authority to regulate the practice of medicine, which includes saying what is or is not a medicine. All the federal government, through the FDA, can do is say whether or not the prescribed label for a drug is truthful and not misleading by showing that it is effective for one medical use and is safe as prescribed. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Yes, I always hear people talking about, on the news about how much stronger that the marijuana is over the marijuana from yesteryear. The question I have is, are they talking about regular marijuana or are they talking about hydroponically grown marijuana?
Okay. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. For one thing, the testing they're talking about that was done, the old testing was horribly specious. It was basically the dregs of whatever the cops had picked up and left sitting out on the evidence room shelf for 2 or 3 years. So it was unusually low. Now, some of the modern strains, I'll go up to maybe 15%, but it doesn't matter. Let's think about something else. If you go out to get a drink, you can buy a beer that runs around 5 to 6% alcohol. You can get a wine that will run 12 to maybe 20% alcohol. You can buy distilled spirits that run from about 40% alcohol up to around 90% of alcohol. And as a drinker, you know how to handle it. If you're drinking 190 proof Everclear, you mix it with a whole lot of grapefruit juice. If you're drinking beer, you can drink it straight. And you know how it affects you, so you know when to quit. With marijuana, since you feel the effect of it almost instantaneously when you inhale it, you know when you've had enough. And unlike alcohol, you don't lose your good sense, so you quit. So really it doesn't matter how strong it is. It's not like Duane's giving you an intravenous injection where he knows how strong it is, but you don't. We've got another. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Yeah, I was wondering what steps have been taken to legalize marijuana in Texas.
Okay. You've been working with it a long time?
I have been to Austin. We've had our rally things where we go down there and bomb the, literally, bad choice of words, where we go down there and we'll take a bus or a tour group or something and we'll go down there and hit all of the representatives' offices. And, you know, surprisingly, we get good feedback. Actually, we do.
Yeah.
I go down there. I remember when Martha Wong was down there, her office said, yes, come on, bring everybody. And I actually had good feedback from Martha Wong's office, if you remember back when she was my rep.
Yeah.
You have to go down there and you have to put forth a little sweat and some effort, and you have to go down there and look your representative in the face and tell them what means the most to you. And as a nurse, I give people stuff that makes them sick, but I know good and well that there's a lot of them that use the cannabis there to combat the side
We've got
effects.
another call, but before we take it, I want to say one thing here. And this is that a lot of politicians say in private, we know you're telling the truth, but we can't afford to admit it in public. And the second is there have been bills in front of the Texas legislature every session in the last 10 years or longer. But let's see what this other caller has to say. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Yeah, I have a question and a quick comment.
Okay.
My comment is the politicians must realize that they work for the people. The people don't work for the politicians, so you're absolutely right. We need to petition them, let them know where we stand, what we want as voting taxpayers. And my question is, when you make a trip to the dentist, don't they usually shoot you up with like a painkiller, Novocaine, Zarcaine? Don't they have certain
yes.
opiates in those drugs?
Okay.
I'd like to say, as far as going to the dentist, a long time ago, cannabis was used because guess what happens whenever you use cannabis? You get the cotton mouth. So you don't have to spit all day. So a long time ago, cannabis was actually used for dentistry.
The funny thing is,
perk there.
You probably run into 3 different painkillers at a dentist. You'll probably get a shot of Novocaine, which is a synthetic derivative of cocaine that's about 100 years old and is used because it doesn't make you high. Second, you'll probably get nitrous oxide, which is a great fun high and more of really an amnesiac than a painkiller. And when you go home, you'll probably take a prescription of Vicodin.
Or Percodan or something like that.
Which is an opiate, just like morphine. So, hello, caller, you're on the air.
I just have a final comment.
Okay.
I don't know the people that smoke marijuana keep their seeds and just start sprinkling them all across town. They stop it. It's a natural weed, right?
Pretty much.
Guess how many seeds there are in a pound? I've got the answer to lots of stuff here. Any clue? There are 27,000 seeds in a pound, so you can plant a forest with just a couple of double handfuls.
I've often wondered what would happen if people just dropped a few seeds out of the window on the medians of the roads as they drove around.
Well,
we're out of time. I want to stress with my first editorial of the year the need to pressure your representatives. Write them. And I counted up on my fingers between city council members, county commissioners, county judges, mayors, sheriffs, district attorneys, state representatives, state senators, U.S. reps, U.S. senators, presidents, governors. If you wrote one letter a month, which would take 5 or 10 minutes maybe, you wouldn't be able to get the whole list of them in a single year. So start now, go down the list, keep it going. They can't do what you say unless you let them know you're saying it. And remember this, come November, you've got a chance to fire those of them that aren't listening to you. So it's a new day in Houston, a new year in Houston. Let's hope for the best and work to make sure it happens. And we are glad you could join us tonight. Remember to keep your pets, pipes, and especially plants clear in the frost. And good night.
We have these private prisons that have now hired lobbyists to go get minimum mandatories and
I began to understand that the 17 or the 19-year-old kid I had in the backseat of my police car was not a criminal at all. Remove the profit motive. If you remove do away with almost all these problems. How do you do that? Simple. Again, prohibition, which can only mean one thing. Legalize drugs. Legalize all drugs.
If we really want to improve our urban neighborhoods, the most important thing that we could do, the single most important thing that we could do, is end the war on drugs.